Have you ever thought a town could go into hibernation just because its neighbors no longer cross over to buy gas, pick up Amazon packages, or have a cheap dinner? It sounds absurd, but that's exactly what's happening from Blaine, Washington to Darby Line, Vermont. Places that once buzzed like familiar rest stops for Canadians are now on artificial life support just to stay alive. What happened? Simply put, Canadians have stopped crossing the border. As shopping centers on the US side emptied of Ontarians, America has come to realize that dependence on neighborly ties isn't forever. Today, let's explore 5 American border towns on the brink, while Canada's retail sector is booming. Please note that this information is compiled from statistical data and is not intended to disparage any organization. Number 1, Blaine, Washington. Can you believe it? Blaine no longer lives off Canada, and perhaps it never will again. It sounds absurd, but the very closeness that once gave this town its strength has now become a fatal weakness. Blaine, a small town tucked in at the northernmost tip of Washington state, used to thrive on weekend car trips from Vancouver. Now the lights are still on, the stores are still open, but the crowds are gone. For years, Blaine was a familiar stop for thousands of British Columbians. Every weekend, lines of cars crossed the border to fill up on gas, pick up Amazon packages, buy medicine, grab a meal, and head back the same day. Stores stayed open through the afternoon. The town needed no factory, no university, just that steady consumer flow to keep going, and indeed, it worked. According to estimates from the Northern Light, during peak months before 2025, Canadians contributed up to 60% of Blaine's total retail revenue, an extraordinary figure, but also a double-edged sword. When a place's economy is tethered to the habits of its neighbor, even minor changes on the other side can set off a chain reaction no one is prepared for. Then, that change came faster than anyone expected. In June 2025, U.S. Customs and Border Protection data cited by the Seattle Times showed vehicle crossings through Blaine had dropped by more than 75% compared to the same period last year. 3 of the 5 major gas stations shut down. Over 20 Amazon pickup and logistics points ceased operations. The local barber shop opens only 3 days a week. Restaurants scrapped lunch service due to low traffic. A once bustling town now sits quietly, like the final stop of a journey no one chooses anymore. The question isn't what is happening, but rather why did it happen and why so fast? Since early 2025, US-Canada trade policies have grown more strained. Certain US political proposals regarding tariffs, import incentives, and even comments about annexing Canada as a future state, though unofficial, were enough to make many Canadians feel alienated and confused. And that stirred up a seemingly simple question: why should we go over there when everything we need is already here? As that question spread, concrete actions followed. British Columbia quickly invested in its domestic logistics system. New centers like Surrey Central Pickup Hub and Langley Fulfillment Zone were built at astonishing speed, allowing Canadians to receive goods faster, cheaper, and more conveniently without crossing the border. The provincial government also rolled out support packages for local businesses, making Canadian goods not only competitive but cheaper by saving on taxes and shipping costs. Bit by bit, the reasons that once drew Canadians across the border began to disappear, and then a string of unwelcome incidents occurred. In May 2025, a Canadian family of 6 was detained for over 3 weeks at the Blaine border crossing due to unresolved administrative issues, causing media uproar. Though not the first case of its kind, the timing and sentiment made the incident a tipping point for the idea: if we don't go, we don't get into trouble. Around the same time, a small stone wall was erected along the border near Blaine, as reported by the Northern Light, as part of a security program. Though technically insignificant, the image led many Canadians to feel that perhaps the warmth of the past had grown distant, and so Blaine lost the lifeblood that sustained it. Not because it did anything wrong, not because its residents are to blame. They were simply the first to bear the brunt of shifts far beyond their control. Whatcom County, where Blaine is located, has already warned of potential budget cuts for public health services and welfare programs. An emergency hearing was held with Senator Patty Murray present, but proposed solutions remain on paper. The idea of turning Blaine into a duty-free zone to retain interstate consumers sounds reasonable but lacks traction. Young people in town no longer pin their hopes on Canadians coming back. For them, the bigger question is, can Blaine survive if it's no longer anyone's stop? And that's what unsettles people most, because Blaine has no industry to fall back on, no university, no financial services, no innovation hub. Blaine lived off a habit that's now outdated, a local economy based on transitory traffic. Now, with that flow gone, it's as if the town has lost its support beam. Canadians aren't exactly thrilled either. They're satisfied with the efficient domestic system, but occasionally admit to missing something. A familiar trip, a diner just across the road, a spontaneous chat with a neighbor from another country. But even that feeling isn't strong enough to draw them back. The Peace Arch, symbol of friendship between the two nations, still stands. The sky is still blue, the grass still green, but the warm handshakes and caravans of cars are gone. Not because the border is closed, but because people no longer need to cross it. And if this can happen in Blaine, a town once called the heartbeat between two nations, what will become of smaller, quieter towns? Number 2, Calais, Maine. Something strange is happening in Calais, Maine. No one has shut this town down, yet hardly anyone walks through it anymore. The same old streets remain, the checkout counters are still open, the supermarket lights still on, but the absence is undeniable. Not loud like the bang of a closing gate, but a quiet, steady void, like a cold meal no one wants to serve, day after day. Calais isn't like Blaine. There are no silent Amazon warehouses or dust-covered gas stations. The dwindling here comes from small things, fewer orders, emptier buses. This town once served as the communal kitchen of the border area. Residents of St. Stephen, New Brunswick only had to cross the bridge over the St. Croix River to reach Calais for groceries, gas, medicine, and household items. A short trip, but one that fostered the closeness of neighbors sharing a home. But by early 2025, that flow of people suddenly thinned out. There was no announcement, no sudden disruption, just trips that no longer repeated themselves. According to data from Spectrum News and Bangor Daily News, order volumes at stores like C&L Feeds dropped by as much as 61% within the first 2 months of the year. U.S. Customs and Border Protection also recorded over 3,000 fewer border crossings in February 2025 compared to the same month the previous year. Not a large number on a national scale. But for Calais, a town that relied on those weekend grocery runs, it's a gap that isn't easy to fill. From across the bridge, the reason for the change isn't hard to grasp. St. Stephen, a small town in New Brunswick, has gradually transformed in recent years. What was once home to just a few scattered shops is now one of the most modern retail hubs along the northeastern border. A new Atlantic superstore opened earlier this year. The local mall expanded. The online delivery systems of Canada Post and major chains like Sobeys, Giant Tiger, and Walmart Canada have grown rapidly, bringing goods straight to doorsteps within 48 hours. With the CAD-USD exchange rate dropping below 0.70 in June, the lowest in 5 years, Canadians realized they were losing more than they gained by shopping in the US. Prices were no longer cheaper. Currency exchange fees, import taxes, and the need to declare goods upon return all made the once familiar trip a hassle. Meanwhile, in Calais, nothing changed. And that precisely is the problem. The shops are still open, the signs are still lit, but without Canadian customers, the air feels heavier. Not because of chaos, but because day by day, life quietly drains from the town. The most notable thing is the people of Calais did nothing wrong. They didn't change their service, they didn't raise prices, they didn't close unexpectedly, they simply couldn't keep others when the world across the river had become too complete. In Calais, some stores still hang signs reading "family-owned since 1955, but no one in the family wants to carry it on. For older residents, this quietness feels like a long winter with no sign of when the snow will melt. But for the younger generation, the question is different. They're choosing other paths, not out of resentment, but because they no longer want to rely on the uncertainty of a relationship across the river. They can't keep waiting. Many young people have left Calais, heading to larger cities like Bangor, Portland, or even further south to Massachusetts, places where jobs aren't tied to a border. Remote work, the creative economy, technology, healthcare, industries that don't require customers from Canada have become far more attractive than a half-life in a town once sustained by someone else's footsteps. On the other side, St. Stephen is entering a vibrant phase. Internal data from the Atlantic Division of the Retail Council of Canada shows retail sales in St. Stephen rose over 12% in Q2 of 2025 compared to the same period last year, the largest increase in the past 8 years. Local retailers are hiring more staff, extending hours. Many shops that were once secondary outlets are now main locations. Calais looks across and suddenly sees itself left behind, not because someone turned away, but because the economic current has shifted, and the place that used to be a destination has become yesterday's stop. This change came with no bang. It simmers like a small flame in an old kitchen, just bright enough that no one puts it out, but not warm enough to make anyone stay. From St. Stephen, some still look toward Calais with a touch of longing, but the feeling of crossing the border isn't the same anymore. Some Canadians describe a strange, distant sensation, not quite sure if they're still welcome like before. There's no physical barrier, but an invisible line is thickening, the psychological border. Not everyone says it aloud, but everyone feels it, and that feeling makes the bridge seem farther than 100 kilometers. If Blaine is where the sound of things falling apart can be heard day by day, then Calais is where silence begins to take shape, and just a few hours' drive west lies Darby Line, a town where the border is only a faint line across the library floor. But like Calais, it too is slowly becoming a hyphen no one writes past anymore. The border once existed only as a chalk line resting quietly across the wooden floor of the Haskell Library. Children played soccer across it, adults read books at the same table, one half of their body in the US, the other in Canada, without needing a single piece of identification. The place was once called the softest border in the world. No fences, no guards, no sense of strangeness. But by 2025, everything began to change. And what shocked the people of Darby Line wasn't a loud incident, but the quiet withdrawal from across the street. This spring, the US government tightened border policies, requiring Canadians, even those just visiting the library, to report through the side entrance and go through customs. A small bureaucratic step, but a turning point for the whole town. The Haskell Free Library, once a symbol of borderlessness, now has only one official entrance, with a fence and a passport scanner. From the Canadian side, the reaction wasn't fierce. There were no protests, but people found another way. In the town of Stansted, across the border, local stores were upgraded. Retail chains like Pharmaprix, Metro, and Dollarama expanded. The Community Arts Center was renovated using provincial funds from Quebec. The local delivery system developed rapidly. There was no longer any reason to cross into the US for shopping or to see a musical. Meanwhile, in Darby Line, the already modest retail activity grew even more sparse. A grocery store shut down in April. The secondhand bookshop near the library now opens only 2 days a week. The souvenir store, once sustained by Canadian tourists, stopped taking orders after Easter. Retail revenue dropped over 35% compared to the same period in 2024, according to internal data from the Northeast Kingdom Business Council. For a town of just over 600 people, that's no longer just a statistic, it's a warning. Darby Line has no factories, no universities, no logistics. All the town has is passage. It depends on someone walking in from the other side, buying a book, having a coffee, sitting down to see a play, then leaving. When that flow stopped, the town didn't collapse, it withered. In Stansted, residents aren't celebrating the distance, but they no longer feel they need Darby Line. With a weak Canadian dollar, exchange fees, customs checks, and wait times, everything has become inconvenient. Step by step, Canadians have learned self-sufficiency. They built their own stage, developed local retail, ordered books from Quebec publishers instead of visiting the Haskell Library. What used to be a convenient backyard has now become a beautiful but distant memory. Darby Line remains unchanged. Older residents still visit the library, still stand by the door waiting for someone from the other side to drop by, but they no longer come. One person described the feeling as losing a part of your soul. Not because anyone did something wrong, but because the other side has grown up. Inside the library, the chalk line between the two countries fades more each day, but the gap between the two communities grows ever clearer. The physical border has been tightened, but it's the psychological border that makes Darby Line feel most isolated. In Canada, the community raised nearly $30,000 Canadian to build a new entrance to the library from their side, over $5,000 of which came from author Louise Penny. A small contribution, but one rich in meaning. If they can't share the same space, they'll create their own and still live well. And here is where the two sides' mindsets begin to fully diverge. For Canadians, the separation is no longer a loss, but an opportunity to stand on their own. Many breathed a sigh of relief upon realizing that cutting ties with Darby Line wasn't as hard as they thought. They can still access knowledge, culture, commerce without crossing a border. A quiet independence, but one they're proud of. They didn't make noise, but they made it work, and that made them feel stronger than ever. Meanwhile, in Darby Line, the feeling is the opposite. Residents suddenly realized they had depended too much on footsteps from the other side. Everything, from the bookstore's revenue to the sense of community, was tied to the presence of their neighbors. And when that presence disappeared, they didn't know what to do but wait. Some young people in town proposed a reinvention, turning the place into a cultural tourism site, emphasizing its unique, no-barrier history. But they too understand that without visitors, history becomes just a display. The story of Darby Line isn't as loud as Blaine's or as aching as Calais'. It's quieter, sadder, and more profound. Because when a connection is lost, not due to conflict or dispute, but because the other side no longer needs you, that's a loss no measure can capture. And so people begin to wonder, if one day the library reopens, the fence comes down, and the policies are relaxed, would Canadians even want to return? Or has Darby Line become a town of memory, a place where there once existed a border with no checks, no fences, no distance, but now remains only in history books? Number 4. Pembina, North Dakota. Some towns are left behind by floods, some are drained by politics. But in Pembina, North Dakota, the cause is surprisingly simple. Canadians stopped coming. Located right on the border, Pembina was once a quiet but essential stop in the North American logistics chain, not a tourist destination, not a bustling commercial hub. The town functioned like a small power station, keeping the flow of goods between Winnipeg and the US uninterrupted. Trucks, parcels, express deliveries, they all passed through here, all paused for a few minutes, and it was those few minutes that sustained an entire community. But since early 2025, the traffic no longer comes as steadily as before. There was no ban, no new fence. It's just that the other side, Canada, chose to take control of its own logistics chain. Emerson, a small town in Manitoba that once played a supporting role, has now become the central hub. A series of new distribution centers have sprung up. Canada Post, Purolator, and FedEx Canada are operating at full capacity. Winnipeg, once relying on the US for logistics, has become completely independent. People just place an order and wait 24-48 hours for delivery. No border crossing, no immigration paperwork, no currency conversion fees. And then something very simple happened. They stopped coming. In Pembina, the impact was swift and clear. Mike's Parcel Center, once handling hundreds of packages daily, is now barely operating. FedEx and UPS routes that used to make regular stops have gradually pulled out. The roadside cafe no longer sees truck drivers stopping by. Auto repair shops, electronics accessory stores, battery swap stations, all once sustained by hurried visitors, now open their doors without knowing if anyone will come. In the middle of town stands a building that used to be a major logistics center. The sign is still there, the barcode scanner still lit, the delivery schedule still neatly posted, but the dust grows thicker. That building seems to be silently waiting for someone to flip the switch, but the switch is now across the border, where no one is looking back. The impact isn't limited to logistics. The entire small ecosystem around it is also shaken. The grocery store serving drivers has lost nearly half its revenue. The air conditioner repair shop no longer gets service requests from freight trucks. Stores selling power converters, travel chargers, and small items once meant for Canadian customers now count their visitors on one hand. According to estimates by the Pembina County Economic Council, revenue from border services has dropped over 30% compared to the same time last year. Most of the local budget, once dependent on cross-border trade, is now running a deficit, forcing delays or cuts in spending on infrastructure, libraries, and community services. No alarm sounded in advance, but little by little, Pembina is losing the things that once kept it alive. Across the border, Canada didn't say goodbye. They just moved on and no longer needed to return. Manitoba media call this the post-border autonomy era, when relying on external systems is no longer necessary. What was once dependency has now become a choice. And when that choice no longer includes Pembina, the town gradually fades from the mental map of its northern neighbors. Seen from above, the reversal is clear. Emerson, once just a small stop, has now become the region's key hub. Orders from Montreal to Winnipeg now stop here, then spread out across the borderlands. No need to go far, no need to touch US soil. Meanwhile, Pembina, despite having the facilities, infrastructure, even the strategic location, just sits there, like a train station where the trains no longer run. Amid these changes, Pembina residents are beginning to realize something they had never considered. Their town was never a destination. It existed only as a waypoint, sustained by being plugged into someone else's system. And when the other side learned to operate independently, the town lost its very purpose. Can the town pivot? Find a new role? Or will it fade into silence like a power outlet no one plugs into anymore? The answer may lie in the next place we're headed, a smaller town, once a mirror image of its cross-border neighbor. The two sides shared a street, a park, a sports field. But then, as Canada kept growing, the US side faded, first from original to copy, then from copy to shadow. Number 5. Sault Ste. Marie. Perhaps this is the story that makes you reflect the most, because if the previous towns were simply located next to Canada, like neighbors sharing a fence, this town is something else. A different version, a true twin. One bears the American surname, the other the Canadian, but they share the same name, Sault Ste. Marie. The two cities share the St. Mary's River. Both look out over Lake Superior. Both speak English. Both hold winter festivals and summer fairs. In previous years, no one even needed to ask which side are you from, because whether it was the Michigan or Ontario shore, people came and went as if the only difference was the color of the license plate. The international bridge over the river was like a soft thread binding the two, not by law but by habit and affection. The toll station lights were on 24/7, cars lined up from early morning, reunions, shopping, dining, all began with a gentle honk on the bridge. But now those lights are still on. The digital signs still scroll, only there's barely anyone reading them. A former border control officer shared that the morning shifts are now understaffed. The cameras still turn, the signs still update, but the common feeling is like guarding a road no one chooses to take anymore. On the map, the international bridge still links the two cities, but in reality, it no longer connects anything. People have started calling it a one-way road. Not because of traffic laws, but because the gaze from the other side no longer turns back. Data from March 2025 shows that round trips from Ontario to Michigan have dropped nearly 48% compared to the same period last year. Meanwhile, the entire state of Michigan has seen a 32% decline. In this small city of just over 14,000 residents, the impact is even more pronounced. A local economy that once depended on Canadian visitors for over 70% of its activity now feels like a sailboat caught in dead wind. For Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan, this isn't just lost revenue, it's the loss of a familiar rhythm of daily life. Cafes that used to open at 6 a.m. now start at 9 because no one comes early anymore. A souvenir shop closes mid-week. A riverside hotel keeps its sign lit, seemingly just to declare, "We're still here." Family-owned restaurants that once bustled on weekends now host only a few familiar locals. There used to be picture-perfect stories across the bridge, student exchange programs, joint festivals, river lantern competitions. But slowly, everything began to recede, not due to conflict, but simply because one side no longer needed it. Across the river, Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario is transforming rapidly. In just the past 2 years, the city has received over $65 million CAD in provincial funding to upgrade its tourism sector, recreation centers, a casino, lakeside museums, domestic cruise lines, local vacation tours under the Destination Ontario program. Residents of Ontario who once flocked to Michigan for low prices and new experiences now realize everything they need can be built at home. And when that happens, there's no need to say goodbye. They just stay. An internal report from Destination Northern Ontario shows that retail and tourism revenue here grew over 11% in Q2 2025, the highest regional growth rate since the pandemic. From cafes to hotels, malls to pharmacies, everything runs smoothly without relying on American visitors. Canadians didn't have to announce a separation, but by spending domestically, they've created an irreversible reality. They are no longer dependent. They don't need to cross over to feel fulfilled anymore. The International Bridge, a symbol of connection, still stands, but it's no longer a necessary passage in daily life. On the Michigan side, the silence is becoming more tangible. Not the collapse of Blaine, not the emptiness of Pembina, but a quiet letdown, steady and subtle, like a light dimming so slowly that no one notices until the darkness has already filled the room and the switch hasn't been flipped back on. At Lake Superior State University, some international events that once drew large Canadian audiences are seeing thinner attendance. Hotel bookings ahead of the summer festival are down over 60% year over year. A report from the Michigan Economic Center notes a slight uptick in unemployment in the service sector, especially retail and dining concentrated in border regions. In community meetings, residents have begun to ask a new question. If we're no longer a place for others to shop, vacation, or pass through, then what is Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan? Some local groups have started looking for new directions, restoring heritage tourism, promoting cross-forest hiking routes, developing educational and clean agriculture potential. A bookstore owner has shifted from selling souvenirs to hosting community talks and sharing local knowledge as a way to rewrite the story from within. Meanwhile, across the bridge, Ontario's tourism campaigns are in full swing. Beauty at your doorstep, no passport needed to see the world, Sault Ste. Marie, the bright side of the river. On Instagram and Facebook, a flood of images from the other side, crowded morning cafes, glowing harbors, sold-out fall tours. Some Michigan residents say it now feels like looking into a mirror with the light shining only one way. The mirror is still there, but the reflection is fading, not because they have changed, but because the other side no longer looks back. This feeling doesn't come from wounded pride, but from a simple truth. When a familiar part of yourself no longer shows up each day, you're forced to ask, who am I when I can no longer see myself in someone else's eyes? And then that question leads to something deeper. Perhaps the debate over who is the original, who is the copy, who depended on whom, who once shone brighter, no longer matters. What matters is, if there's no one left to reflect you, can you shine on your own? A sad story, perhaps, but also perhaps the beginning of a rebirth. Because sometimes it's not about being a mirror for someone else. It's about being a place where you can stand tall, look ahead, and know that you deserve to be seen, even if no one calls your name anymore. Sometimes being too close isn't necessarily a good thing, especially when familiarity turns into dependence without us even realizing it. Among the border towns that once connected two worlds, Americans are only now beginning to wake up. They once believed that this relationship was mutually beneficial, a sustainable partnership, but everything changed when one side chose to let go. Blaine gasps like a body short on oxygen. Calais grows cold like a kitchen no one visits anymore. Darby Line loses the warmth of friends who once shared the same roof. Pembina becomes a power station gone dark, and Sault Ste. Marie is left staring into a mirror that reflects a fading self, while its sibling across the way grows ever brighter. This isn't just a story about retail, tourism, or logistics, it's a wake-up call against complacency. If you found this analysis insightful, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss our next deep dive into the stories that shape our world. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you witnessed similar changes in your community? What do you think the future holds for these border towns?